lanolin, unique, 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 New York. Is it recording? Hi. If you've been following my build along on YouTube, I started when it was already car-shaped. So instead of doing an update this week where I'm showing what's going on now and be going on in the future, I'm going to go back in the past a little bit and show you what happened with the car before I started filming on YouTube. So the start of this story starts off with my old car, a Mark II Golf. I won't go into it too much. It's a story for another day. I wanted to progress this car to the next level, and I came to the conclusion that I was just throwing good money after bad. It needed too much work. So I decided it was time to start what was almost my dream project. It was a little bit of a compromise. I'll go over it all one day, but this is as close as I can afford to do right now. Scrapping the shell of the old car, I sold all the good parts that were worth money, but just kept the engine. It gave me enough money to start this build now. I managed to come across a Mark I caddy that was in dire need of repair. The owner had been wanting to restore the car and had had it media blasted, but it just needed too much repair. It was really just good for chopping up for parts for other cars, but for me this is ideally what I wanted. So I picked up the car, brought it home, and I cut off all the parts that I didn't need. Cut out the floor, bulkhead, front end of the car. I put in bracing so that the car would retain its shape. And then what I've done is I made a chassis jig, or a chassis table. So it's box section, square and flat on the floor. I then had some plates laser cut by Charlie, the guy that owns the fastest Volkswagen up in the world, the guy from this video here. Or it might be this here, I don't know, my left or right. It'll be up there, that guy. So I had some plates laser cut which would hold the hubs of the car. So I measured out what I wanted the wheelbase of the car to be and mounted these hubs to the chassis table so that the wheels would be exactly where I want. I then mounted the body onto the table so that the body and hubs were set in a fixed space where they needed to be. I mounted the engine to my new gearbox and made a stand to go underneath so I could mount the engine and the gearbox where that needed to be. So I measured it all out time and time again until I had that right, and once that was all sorted I could just fill in the inside of this with tube, fill in the missing pieces. So rear suspension, I just made a solid rear beam, all very straightforward. First major problem, first big hurdle. This is a story for another day, but this build is a compromise for what I really want to build. I'm looking at this as practice. This is a dream car to build for me, but it is not the dream car. But the one stipulation I gave myself is I want wide front tyres and I want them to be as close. I don't want them to be poking out. I don't want a small bodied car with wheels sticking out from the body. I really like the look of big wheels tucked underneath the body, and it takes an awful lot of work. This is where the problem started, where my initial plan was to use stock hubs, wheel bearings from the Mark II Golf and then modify them to be able to bring them inboard so I could get the wheels in tighter. This caused all sorts of problems and I almost got away to get there. I made several pairs of wishbones at the bottom. I could get that mounted working fine. Because of how low I want the car to be, it ended up with suspension mounts really quite high up. They would have been sticking out the bonnet. I would have had to have some sort of support going all the way along over the engine or something to hold these. It just wasn't working. I played around with loads of ideas of this and it just didn't, I just couldn't ever get it quite right. So finally playing around with it, I came up with a solution to use double wishbones. It would mean I wouldn't use a McPherson strut, do the inboard suspension, so they would be much lower down. Turning circle isn't going to be brilliant. It is better than I thought it would be, but it isn't great. I need to play around with it. I can play around with the Ackerman. The problem is when the wheels are in close, when you turn, they're going to want to hit the engine, so I can only turn so far. Obviously the further out the wheels are, the more they can turn in, so I may have to space them out a little bit further to get a better turning circle, but hopefully I'll be able to keep them in quite nicely. I've learned an awful lot along the way of building the chassis. There's a lot that if I could go back, I would do differently. Don't think I've made the cab area big enough. Considering I'm building a car for me, the amount of room I've left myself to sit inside, it's adequate, but I don't think it's going to be comfortable. Doesn't matter, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to be sat in it for too long. If I'd given myself 6 inches more leg room, it would have been perfect, and I do have the room there. So the actual design of the chassis itself, following the rule book, the specifications are very much for the cockpit area. So there really isn't a lot you can do with that. The floor design is already done. I have a main hoop that follows the contour of the car around. Front bars, you can't do an awful lot with that. The rear, I've just looked around at what other people have done and just loosely copied their designs. There's not a great deal of information about tube chassis front wheel drive cars online. There's not an awful lot of them around. Lots of people that have fast ones don't like giving away information, so I've sort of just made it up as I've gone along, really. The front is completely my own design that I've kind of made up as I've gone along. Wanting to keep the car narrow, I don't really have any room for bars to go round the outside of the engine, where they'd normally follow the side of the wing. So all of the support is at the back. There is a bar that goes over the gearbox, so this supports the front of the chassis, and I've supported quite a lot where the engine mounts, but I consider the engine itself to be structural to the chassis. Where it's bolted in, it holds the chassis still. That's the way it works in my head. I've still not finished the front engine mount, but it will probably tie into both chassis legs either side, so this will support it even more. I'm hoping it won't flex. If it does, I'm going to have to rethink it, but there's a few things that I could do. So that's it really. No update for you this week. I've got a few things going on in the background. I'm going to do some other videos. I've got a lot of small jobs I just need to tidy up. I don't want to do updates every week if it's just boring, finishing off little jobs, bits and pieces. I want them to be full, exciting jobs. Bigger things that might be a little bit more interesting, rather than I put a few bolts in here and a few rivets there. So hopefully you're caught up with the build all the way from the start, because I did realise that I started doing build updates sort of halfway through building a car, so people may have wanted to know what happened before. But if you've got any questions about it, just let us know. And you stay classy.